Hi, everyone.
Hi again. We have reached, in the Proclaimer's book, page 35 of the chapter, The Great Apostasy Develops. Here they are dealing again, at least for the second time in the book, with the problem of clergy and laity. Now, we talked about that angle before, so we won't dwell on it here, except in as much as it suggests something different in the way of comparisons. I couldn't help but think, as I went over this material the other day in preparation for this video, of the great and famous statement of Lord Acton: power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Of course, when Acton wrote that, he was not talking about cults, although the Watchtower and the other cults were already starting in that very generation. So this would be in the 1880s. And what was on his mind immediately was the recent developments in Europe. For 100 years, revolution had been in the air. He had grown up during the period of the 1840s revolutions. But since then, Vatican Council had declared the Pope infallible. So Lord Acton, as a loyal Roman Catholic, had to deal with the fact that his own church was showing a tendency towards absolutism, such as it had showed in the Middle Ages several times. And after all, what had happened then was war. For a couple of 100 years, Europe was distracted by the wars between Protestants and Catholics. And now, in his own lifetime, Lord Acton was seeing something ominous develop. In that same generation, John Henry Newman had left the Anglican Church, one of the most famous Anglicans in the world, and become Roman Catholic. So that was in the air too. What's going to happen next in England? Catholic people had been emancipated in England just before Acton was born, which was a tremendous development when you think of it, because they had been limited in their freedoms since the Reformation. So 300 years of history had gone by. And when Acton said that, he was actually writing a letter to an Anglican bishop lamenting the fact that we didn't want to go backwards now after we'd made so much progress in even building the communication between people of different affiliations and commitments, as Anglicans and Roman Catholics had been at this point for over 300 years. So Acton was on the dissenting side when Vatican Council was called, and he and his friend, the great Catholic scholar Dollinger, had been among those that were pilloried really by their fellow loyal Catholics for not going along with this change. So Acton knew what persecution was, and when he's talking to an Anglican bishop, he's lamenting the fact that we don't have to go this way. And of course, everybody had to worry in those days about the effects of these revolutions. But when Acton said power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely, he said it in short compass, what many thinkers and historians had been saying for centuries anyway. For instance, William Pitt, who had been Prime Minister of England about 100 years before. William Pitt the Elder, because both he and his son had become Prime Ministers. But the original William Pitt, who was a commoner, he was called the Great Commoner, had said something similar about the nature of power. Pitt had served as Prime Minister of England during the 7 Years' War back in the 1750s. And then he had opposed the Revolutionary War. He had opposed what the course Britain was set on, that led up to the Revolutionary War with America. And of course, therefore, it must have been depressing for those who survived the revolutionary period in the 18th century, like William Pitt Younger did. He then became the Prime Minister when Napoleon, who was another commoner, rose to power. So all of these men, the two Pitts and Lord Acton, were necessarily disturbed by the tendency of power to accumulate more power around itself. And that's the setting that causes me to be distressed when we think about the rise of the cults, that all of the cults are essentially power grabs by men who really have no credentials for power. Napoleon had been at least a great general, and he had the world behind him for a while until he became the emperor, and that disillusioned many people, including Beethoven, who had dedicated his Third Symphony, the Eroica, to Beethoven and then scratched out that dedication when he saw what Napoleon was now doing. So that's all what's in my mind as I read this discussion of clergy laity here, that it's all really smoke and mirrors, because we're talking about terminology here. So let's read it over, and I think you'll see what we mean, and then maybe return to Lord Acton at the end if we have time.
So the subheading is Clergy and Laity. All of you are brothers, Jesus has said to his disciples. Your leader is one, the Christ. So there was no clergy class within Christian congregations of the first century. As Spirit-anointed brothers of Christ, all the early church had the prospect of being heavenly priests with Christ. As an organization, each congregation was supervised by a body of overseers or spiritual elders. All the elders had equal authority, and not one of them was authorized to lord it over the flock in their care. However, as the apostasy unfolded, things began to change quickly.
Among the earliest deviations was a separation between the terms overseer, that is the Greek episkopos, and older man, or elder, Greek presbyteros, so that they were no longer used to refer to the same position of responsibility. Just a decade or so after the death of the Apostle John, Ignatius, bishop of Antioch, and they have bishop here in quotation marks, in his letter to the Smyrnians wrote, quote, "See that you all follow the bishop, that is overseer, as Jesus Christ follows the Father, and the presbytery, the body of older men, as if it were the apostles," unquote. Ignatius thus advocated that each congregation be supervised by one bishop or overseer, who was to be recognized as distinct from and having greater authority than the presbyters or older men. How, though, did this separation come about? Augustus Neander, in his book The History of the Christian Religion and Church During the 3 First Centuries, explains what happened. Quote, "In the 2nd century, the standing office of president of the presbyters must have been formed, to whom, inasmuch as he had especially the oversight of everything, was the name of episkopos given, that is bishop, and he was thereby distinguished from the rest of the presbyters."
The groundwork was thus laid for a clergy class gradually to emerge. About a century later, Cyprian, bishop of Carthage, North Africa, was a strong advocate of authority of the bishops as a group separate from the presbyters, later known as priests, the deacons, and the laity. But he did not favor the primacy of one bishop over the others.
As bishops and presbyters ascended the hierarchical ladder, they left below it the rest of the believers in the congregation. This resulted in a separation between clergy, those taking the lead, and laity, the passive body of believers. Explains McLintock and Strong's Cyclopedia, quote, "From the time of Cyprian, who died about 258 CE, the father of the hierarchical system, the distinction of clergy and laity became prominent, and very soon was universally admitted. Indeed, from the 3rd century onward, the term clerus was almost exclusively applied to the ministry to distinguish it from the laity. As the Roman hierarchy was developed, the clergy came to be not merely a distinct order, but also to be recognized as the only priesthood."
Thus, within 150 years or so of the death of the last of the apostles, 2 significant organizational changes found their way into the congregation. First, the separation between bishop and the presbyters, with the bishop occupying the top rung of the
hierarchical?
Okay, ladder. Second, the separation between the clergy and the laity. Instead of all spirit-begotten believers forming a royal priesthood, the clergy were now recognized as the only priesthood. Such changes marked a defection from the scriptural method of governing the congregations in the apostles' days. Organizational changes, though, were not the only consequences of the apostasy.
So why is this smoke and mirrors? Because almost all the facts in here are correct.
Well, it's always your slant. You know, the way you present things. There's no nuance, for one thing.
So the application of the word apostasy to what amounts to a development is the real problem here. It's the angle you take to it.
Yeah.
For instance, they're using Augustus, Neander, McLintock, and Strong as their reference points. They're taking information from the clergy and scholars of Christendom, admitting these things did develop, telling the truth, according to you, about what happened. But what's the difference? Why aren't Neander and McLintock and Strong Jehovah's Witnesses? Because they don't draw the same conclusions that you do about development.
Yeah, that's right.
And where's the governing body here? I mean, in all of this development that you just traced over a page, where is the governing body to supervise what's going on or to quell these tendencies you think we're having?
You know, and when you think of it, like we're talking about church structure. Well, the witnesses have a structure to their church. Now they've flip-flopped a lot on whether or not we should have a group of elders, one elder, you know.
What we should call them?
Yeah, and they call them different things, so I don't even know what they call them now.
It used to be elders, then congregation servant, then presiding overseer.
Yeah.
And elders under the presiding overseer. Not really under, rotation.
And I mean, when you have circuit overseers and district overseers, are they not on a higher rung? I mean, couldn't someone say that? They're on a higher rung? So to me, it's a matter of it's okay for us, and when we do it, it's just a development to the benefit of the brothers. But when Christendom does it, somehow it's nasty, it's bad, it's evil.
It changes apostasy if it's Christendom.
Yeah.
But changes new light if it's us.
Yeah. So to me, this is smoke and mirrors. Is the right way of putting it.
So I want to say that most of this is factually true, but the slant. Ignatius, for instance, in paragraph 2 here. Ignatius, Bishop of Antioch, when he writes these very things about submit to you or cling to your bishop and your elders, he's going to his death, a bishop martyr going to his death in Rome.
This is not the time for a power grab if you're going to your death.
He's saying, in effect, to protect the flock, I feel it's necessary for you to cling to the leaders who, after all, were appointed by the apostles. The apostles have recently died. The prophets are dying off, according to the evidence we have in the 2nd century. The prophets are dying off. So what do you do without apostles and prophets? You tend to build structures, and by the way, the elder thing wasn't a divinely revealed institution anyway.
Yeah.
It was there already when Moses went back to Egypt after fleeing for 40 years. The elder structure was already there in Israel. So that's not part of the theocratic arrangement as you imagine it as a Jehovah's Witness.
I mean, there's the scripture that talks about honoring those that are taking the lead. There are people in leadership position in church. That's always been the case.
But are they imposed from above by a hierarchy governing body? Or are they rising up from the ranks and being recognized for their excellence?
Yeah.
Their leadership abilities.
Yeah. So I think you do yourself a favor, if you're a witness, to read the church fathers yourselves and see the impression that they give. You know, we are given by this an impression that it's a power grab. They put bishops in quotation marks here. You know, as if this is a dirty word, but it's a real word. It's a real biblical word. So why make it sound like it's got to be nasty? If you were to read the people themselves, the early church fathers themselves, read them, what impression do you get of these men?
You get the impression they're caring individuals who are willing to sacrifice their lives
for the flock,
for the gospel and the flock.
Yeah.
That's these men of the 2nd century, one of whom is named here, Ignatius. And Cyprian is named, and if you look into his life in the 3rd century, you realize those bishops too are fighting sometimes for the life of the church, and they're sacrificing their lives in that cause. That continues to be the case, because we're talking about, they've already mentioned here, 150 years from the death of the last of the apostles. That continues to be the case. This is the age of the martyrs, and yet this is the age that you're complaining about as being a general apostasy.
Yeah.
Next time they get into the paganism aspect of it. But here they're just talking about organization, which of course is their orientation anyway. There's a couple of quotes on the second page here that are worth reading. This is in the footnotes. The English word priest derives from presbyteros, older man or elder, as follows from Middle English, prest, from Old English, prost or prust, from Vulgate Latin, prester, contracted from Late Latin, presbyter, from Greek presbyteros. So they're admitting that the words underwent change as they went through languages into their present day. So the word priest actually comes from a biblical word, which means elder.
Right.
And then they refer to Neander again. They call him this time, no, Dr. Neander.
Yeah. Why are they even recognizing his position?
His authority, yeah. Quote, the false conclusion was drawn that as there had been in the Old Testament a visible priesthood joined to a particular class of men, there must also be the same in the New Testament. The false comparison of the Christian priesthood with the Jewish furthered again the rise of episcopacy above the office of presbyter. So here you have a clergyman again saying this is what happened, but his angle on it is not that it's wholly bad. As it, like with any human institution, it has desirable or good aspects and it has negative aspects.
Right. And the comment that he makes about the Old Testament priesthood, it's a priesthood, not a governing body in the Old Testament. And to the early Christians, they were still meeting in congregations, which were really the synagogue meetings. So they did have their house fellowships, but they still were continuing with the arrangement as it was in the Old Testament for the people who were meeting together at the synagogue and hearing the word read.
So the word clergy is part of the smoke and mirrors here to create the fog for witnesses, which is, what does this word imply in the way of power? And this is why we need to think about Lord Acton again. Lord Acton, I think, if he had lived beyond 1900, when he died, I think in the first decade of the 20th century, if he'd lived, say, to the 1960s when Vatican II happened, I think he would have been refreshed and heartened, because there's the difference between a church and a cult. The Catholic Church was now reaching out to not only other Christian denominations, but to all world religions and saying, let's talk. Others were invited to this Vatican Council. And there was a lot of changes that came out of that council, some of which distressed Catholics, the loyal Catholics who thought that the Catholic Church was making an exclusive claim. So that's the difference between what is a church and a cult. The cult doesn't have the spirit to reform from within. When cults reform, they reform because of outward pressure. Let's say the Mormons in the late 1800s finding new light on polygamy when they needed it because the government was giving them a hard time. Or the witnesses with their constant flip-flops on Romans 13.
Yeah.
Based on what's going on around them at the time, for instance in World War II.
Yeah.
So the Holy Spirit reforms the church from within. There's always prophetic figures throughout the history of the church who've been there and have really been used by God to bring about desirable changes in the churches. And anyway, the kind of power, I think the last point we want to make is power, true power, spiritual power, is influence. It's not coercion.
Yeah.
Judgment is the end run if people don't respond to persuasion, don't respond to kindness. They will ultimately have to be subdued. And that's, I think, what's happened in the history of the Watchtower.
Yeah, well, I think the governing body, which has undergone some changes as well. I mean, in this book they said there was a governing body. What happened to it? That was supposed to be managing all the churches. Well, it's disappeared at this point, and now you're criticizing any changes that they make. And they have a real class distinction.
Yeah.
It doesn't exist in the church. The church has, we're all priests. We're all part of the priesthood and will rule with Christ. For them, there's a special class. But now even that special class, there's a class within that class.
A priesthood within a priesthood.
Yeah, so now the governing body is really the servant. And it's far more powerful than any arrangement that the church has here.
I think we can say for Russell and Rutherford that they must have had some power of persuasion because they deceived an awful lot of people. And if you read Russell's books, you can get a sense of why he was persuasive.
Charismatic personalities. And
maybe we can even give Rutherford credit for charisma anyway, if not for wisdom. But where that is absent, as it is in the current governing body, what do you have left in the way of power?
They have to put strict rule in place to keep their authority and basically shut you off from everyone who disagrees with them.
Yeah. So power now, when you have no power of influence to persuade people, has to be the power of coercion and even punishment.
Yeah. And just call things apostasy when really, this is not apostasy. This is development.
I would here want to give credit to the bishops and even the popes that some of us still despise because of our prejudices. Bishop Westcott, for instance, who became bishop after being already recognized as a great scholar of the New Testament, had a tremendous influence on England in the last decade or so of the Victorian era. The way he intervened on behalf of the working man in strikes and mine strikes and things like that was a marvelous witness as to what a bishop can be if he wants to be. And Lightfoot too had been elevated from being a great Bible scholar to being a bishop, but he didn't live too long beyond that. He didn't even live to his 70s, I don't believe. And in our lifetime, my lifetime anyway, Pope John Paul had enormous influence on the world beyond Catholicism. So much so that some give him the major credit for the transition of Poland from under Soviet tyranny to freedom again. And even when I was a boy, I remember Pope John the 23rd. He was the one who called the Second Vatican Council. And he had a spirit that exuded humility, conviviality. He wanted to bless people. It was very obvious. And Vatican II was a signal that he saw the need for the Catholic Church to reach out and not to be insular and self-protective, as unfortunately many Catholics admit that had been the tendency for all those decades before when the wars were going on, etc., and the battles of higher criticism, etc.
So we're going to link to a video of Franz's, when we were discussing Franz's book, In Search of Christian Freedom. JW Clergy claim priestly power superior even to the apostles. And we'll put in the playlist for slander. A lot of videos in that one.
See you next time when they talk about pagan teachings infiltrating the early church.